We're going to go to 2 Samuel this morning, 2 Samuel chapter 9. I think it's a fairly familiar story. It's the story of David. It's perhaps not one of his best-known stories, but the story of David and Mephibosheth. If you've been around in church for a while, if you've been in Sunday school, you've possibly heard something of this story. Let's see what God's Word has to say to us this morning. In 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1, David asks, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They called him to appear before David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "Your servant," he replied. And the king asked, "Is there no one still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" And Ziba answered the king, "There's a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in both feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. And Ziba answered, "He is at the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, in Lo-debar." And so King David had him brought from Lo-debar, from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel. When Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. And David said, "Mephibosheth." "Your servant," he replied. "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" And the king summoned Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and to his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. And then Ziba said to the king, "Your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do." And so Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table, and he was crippled in both feet. It's a cool story, isn't it? It's a nice story. It's a happy story. It's one of the happier stories in 2 Samuel. As you go through the rest of the book of 2 Samuel, there's not much happiness after this point. But this is a really happy, feel-good story. It's a pretty simple story, and I think, we read it, and I think you could quite easily just pull out a couple of simple applications of the story. We tend to read stories like this as a bit of a moralistic thing. Try hard to be like David. That tends to be the way we read 1 and 2 Samuel. Try and be like David. And isn't David such a nice guy in this story? David helps cripples. You should help cripples. Is that the politically correct term at the moment? Other-abled. Please help other-abled people just as David did. That's often the extent of a story like this. But I think it goes a lot deeper than that, and certainly says something about the gospel, and should certainly say something about what motivates us, or what should motivate us to help those in need. What drives us to show mercy? And for us to see this morning how the gospel moves us just from being moralistic do-good to something a little deeper. So the story of Mephibosheth, we're going to struggle with that all service today. Mephibosheth he's the son of Jonathan, David's best friend, the grandson of Saul, David's greatest enemy. As a child, when the news of the battle in which Saul and Jonathan both died, when that reached home, Mephibosheth was just a little boy, a young child, just a couple of years old, and his nurse held him in her arms and got such a fright when she heard the news that his father was dead that she dropped him. And it's quite possible that that was the point when the child ended up with crippled in both feet. We're not sure if he was born crippled or if it was a result of that action of being dropped as a child. I don't know how many of you were dropped as a child. Some of you, it probably shows. And now he's all grown up, but he's crippled in both legs. He can't walk without sticks. He's in a more enlightened age, he would be in a wheelchair. Now, here's the kind of sad thing about Mephibosheth. His name means shameful thing. That's a cool name for your child. I heard this morning that there's a couple of children being born here. There's one born this week. Is that at the back somewhere? Did I just see it there now? I mean, just a suggestion for a name? No. There's another child coming along soon. You know, there's all sorts of names we could choose for our children. Mephibosheth doesn't quite roll off the tongue, but even if it did, it would be a bit awkward to call your child, I'm ashamed of you. I mean, that's really what it is every day. Every day. Again, not quite sure if that was the name he was born with or if that was the name that was given to him after the accident. It's possible, we don't know all the details, but it's quite possible that Jonathan had a wife and a few others. I mean, his father did, and David will as well. It was the thing of the day. Is that perhaps why this was a shameful child? Was he born out of the wedlock, as it were? Is that why he was called shameful? Is that why we're ashamed of him? Or is it because he's now crippled and the son of the future king is now a cripple? Is that what was shameful about him? Whatever the reason, that's the name that he's stuck with. He's shameful. He now lives in a town called Lo-debar. Lo-debar means no pasture. It's a town that means no land. You're living in a place that has no land. Now, if you know a bit of the Old Testament, a bit of the story of the people of Israel, one of the big things, of course, is the land. And that it is promised land. And that God's people get to inherit the land. And it's not just God's people, the nation, get to inherit a big chunk, but that every family, every individual is given land by God. And that is the sign, one of the signs of God's covenant blessing to His people. You know that you're blessed when you have land, and the big goal, the big dream of every Israelite in the Old Testament is that each man on his own land with his vineyard in the background sitting under his fig tree. That's shalom. That's what we're aiming for. And Mephibosheth lives in a place that means no land. Kind of indicates that he's, in a sense, outside of God's covenant blessing. And of course, not only that, it's not just that he's living in a place that means no land, he's living in someone else's house. He doesn't even own a home in a place that has no land. He literally has nothing. This is not an auspicious look for a life of fullness in the kingdom of God, is it? And then one day, after living in Lo-debar for how many years, who knows, there's a knock at the door, and I suspect it's a knock that Mephibosheth has been expecting for quite some time. He hobbles to the door on his sticks and opens the door, and there's a squadron of soldiers standing at the door. And they say to him, "The king would like to have a word with you." I can only imagine what's going through Mephibosheth's mind at that point. I suspect something along the lines of, finally, the day has come. Let's just get it over with. Lock me up and take me away. See, Lo-debar is at the very bottom end of Judah. It's out of the way. It is about as far away from political center as you can imagine. Mephibosheth has deliberately gone there to just try and live under the radar. Because, although he may be crippled, he's a threat to David. Because he's the legitimate heir to the throne. If we're following from Saul to Jonathan, well, who's next? And so Mephibosheth really is a rallying point for disgruntled Israelites. And Mephibosheth knows that he's a threat to David, so let's just go and live out of the way where no one knows me. I'll just live in someone else's house in a place of no land at the bottom, and surely I'll just be forgotten about. That's the hope. Instead, there's a knock on the door. The king would like to see you. Here's what the king has been doing in chapter 8. It's a list of David's victories. He's gone into this place and conquered that enemy. He's gone into this town here and flattened them. He's taken out that guy just over there and got rid of them. A couple of chapters earlier, Mephibosheth's uncle has been dealt with. He's had his head taken off. David is securing his kingdom. And he's making sure that there are no enemies, that there's no possibility of a civil war, no uprising. He's been dealing with his enemies. And now here is Mephibosheth in this little town in the middle of nowhere, and the king's soldiers come knocking. The king would like to see you. And when he does eventually end up in front of David, I mean, he ends up, you read it, right? We read it. He ends up on his face going, I'm just a dead dog. But what possible threat can I have? I mean, dogs have their moments, don't they? Brad spent half the afternoon chasing his up and down the estate. A dog can be a threat, and if you train them properly, they're good guard dogs, and they'll attack. You can, attack dogs. Great stuff. Errol and Beth had dogs once. I'm off on a tangent now. At Durban North Baptist Church, they had the manse, and then there was like a courtyard, and the fence, the wall, and then the church on the other side. And they had, forgive me, Ingrid, terrible little things. Like little ankle biters. What were they? They're dachshunds, were all the dachshunds. And Errol and Beth had put a big sign on the gate between church and house to say, do not enter. Because vicious dogs, and seriously, they were vicious dogs. And most people knew not to go through that gate, but to go around or phone or knock or shout or something to attract attention so that they would deal with those vicious, violent dachshunds. Everyone except Rowley Adams, the elder of the church, who somehow felt he must have been impregnable and invulnerable and that the laws did not apply to Rowley. And he one day walked in and was savaged by these dogs. And they ripped his Achilles heel and he had to go for stitches. Anyway, so the point is that dogs are nasty and you can train them and they can bite and they're dangerous. And what danger is there in a dead dog? Not a whole lot. And so Mephibosheth is going, David, I am no threat to you at all. I am just a dead dog. And David says to him, do not fear. Now, why does he need to say that? Because Mephibosheth is terrified. He's going to die. It would be the wisest course of action for David to root out all the heirs, anyone that may be related to Saul, and to secure the kingdom and make sure they're all dealt with and out the way. And so Mephibosheth has every right to be terrified. This could well be the end of my life. And David says to him, do not be afraid. Now, the story that I've just told actually started a little earlier. It started with David saying, is there anyone of the house of Saul that I can show kindness to? And it's interesting that David wants to show kindness to the descendants of his greatest enemy. I can understand him saying, is there anyone of the house of Jonathan? Because Jonathan is his friend, and let's be kind to the family of Jonathan. But he doesn't go with Jonathan. I mean, he mentions Jonathan, but he starts with Saul. Is there anyone of the house of Saul that I can show kindness to? And in fact, what David wants to do here is show more than kindness. He wants to show a very lovely Hebrew word, chesed. And chesed is one of those difficult words to translate. It's like yarnia. How do you translate it into English? It's just, chesed is a bit like that. How do you translate it? Sometimes it's translated as mercy. Sometimes it's translated as steadfast love. Sometimes it's translated as kindness, as it is here. Other times it's translated as steadfast love, which is what we often find in the Psalms. Sally Lloyd-Jones wrote a children's Bible, and sometimes explaining things to kids is the best way to understand a word. And she translates the word like this. She calls it God's never stopping, never giving up, unbreakable, always and forever love for his people. That's what David wants to show to a descendant of Saul. Here's David, having conquered his enemies, going, let me think back to the greatest enemy that I've met. Goliath was not his greatest enemy. Let me think back to Saul. Is there any of his descendants that I can show this kind of never stopping, never giving up, unbreakable, always and forever love to? And someone says, hey, yeah, there's this guy Mephibosheth. You should check him out. And so Mephibosheth is brought to David, and look at what David offers this broken human being. Instead of death, instead of the end of the line for Saul, here are the things that David offers him. Number one, do not fear. And you love how it starts. You have nothing to fear from me, Mephibosheth. And David the king releases this man from his fear. I would guess that he's lived in fear since he was 5 years old. He's been told by whatever family members are left, and aunts and uncles or nursemaids or adopted family, whoever he's ended up with, David is the enemy. That's what he's been told. David is the one who got rid of you, who's the cause of the death of your father and grandfather. David's the one who stole your kingdom from you. And they've fed him, and he's lived for years away, out of sight, far from everyone, living in fear of the day when the king would like to speak with you. That fear has lurked at the back of his brain. And David calls to him and says, you have nothing to fear from me. Instead, what I'm offering is covenant love. The second thing that David says to him, he says, I will restore your land. Now, Saul was king, and kings, as they do, amass wealth. That's generally what they're about, and they end up with large pieces of land. Have a look at old Charlie in the UK. I mean, he owns a fairly significant portion of the land in the UK. He owns some of the wealthiest pieces of property in the center of London. He's just hugely wealthy. And so Mephibosheth, in a moment, goes from the guy in Lo Debar, the place of no land, to the guy who owns masses of land in Israel. He goes from someone who is landless to someone who inherits what the king has owned. That's quite a step up for this guy, isn't it? From nothing to everything. And again, it's not just that he's now this huge landowner with lots of wealth at his disposal, and he's got to figure out farming tactics. It's about the fulfillment of God's covenant. Because remember, that's what the fulfillment of the covenant looks like, that God's people possess the land. And this man, who has had no land, has been given a huge amount of land. And it is a sign and a symbol of God's covenant and God's blessing on this man, Mephibosheth. Here's the Israelite who has lost it all, and then it's been restored. And then David says, do not fear, I'm giving you your land back, and you will always eat at my table with my sons. Every day at the king's table. And think about who else is sitting at the king's table every day. Breakfast, lunch, and supper. All of David's greatest warriors are at that table. David's 30 mighty men. They're all sitting at the table. The guy who killed Goliath's brother. And the other guy who killed the other giant who had 6 fingers and 6 toes. And the guys who crossed the border to go and get a bucket of water from the well in, was it Bethlehem for David? The guys who were in the cave with David when Saul came in. Not only that, but David's sons are sitting there. There's Absalom. Absalom didn't just win Stud of the Year 4 times in a row. Absalom was drop dead gorgeous. He was so good looking that even men went weak at the knees when they saw him. He's sitting at the table. And can you imagine? They're all sitting at the table showing off their scars. Remember when I got this one, I was finding that guy, and you did this, and I went there. And, all of that kind of reminiscence as guys do. And the doors open. And at the back, kind of outlined, standing in silhouette, is Mephibosheth on his crutches. And he kind of hobbles into the room, dragging his feet along behind him, and sits himself down at the table and reaches out to grab whatever. Can you imagine Absalom going, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" And Mephibosheth going, "The king invited me." The king invited me. And then David calls in this guy Ziba, who's been the farm manager of Saul's lands and made a nice profit off it. And David says to Ziba, "From now on, you're working for Mephibosheth. You are now Mephibosheth's servant, you and your sons and your servants. You're all working for him, and all the profits you make are going into Mephibosheth's account. You're not skimming off this land anymore because it's never been yours. So it's all for Mephibosheth, and you're working for him. Mephibosheth now has a bunch of servants." Cool. What a bonus if you were, what a bonus that Mephibosheth ends up getting here in this story, isn't it? Now, here's the thing, in case you haven't caught it yet, I'm sure you have, but here's the deal in the story. You are Mephibosheth. I think it's our natural inclination in Bible stories, particularly in these stories about David and Daniel and Moses and so on, to want to place ourselves in the role of hero. That's what we want to do with Bible stories. We like to see ourselves in those roles. It's kind of a cultural thing that we do anyway. We want to be the hero. We want to be the good guy. And so we tend to read the stories of David with a little bit of a be like David. Be like David and you can conquer your giants if you just are brave and pray a lot. And in this story, it's be like David and be nice to cripples. That's really the story, isn't it, for a lot of people? Try hard, be better, be nice, be like David. And when you've got someone weak and at your mercy, be nice to them. When the All Blacks are on their knees, shame. Be nice to them. That's the story that we often get, right? Be like David. I don't think that's how it's meant to work. Mephibosheth is a picture of our spiritual state before God. See, we are the sons of God's greatest enemy. Remember Jesus' words to the Pharisees, how to win friends and influence people, right? They go, we're the sons of Abraham. And Jesus says, no, you're not. You're sons of your father, the devil. Understandably, doesn't go down very well. It's not very nice, but it's true. Just as Mephibosheth was the grandson of Saul, you and I, were children of the devil. We were born with his nature, and sin lurks in our hearts from the start. And no surprise, he was not a particularly good father. He dropped us on our head when we were little. Right? He's abusive, he's a murderer, he's a liar. He leaves his children crippled and broken. And every human being is left crippled by their sin. And the Bible uses lots of metaphors to describe what sin does to us. Talks about it being like a leprosy, a disease where bits drop off. It talks about us being dead in our trespasses and sins. It talks about us being blind and lost. And I think here about us being crippled by our sin. That like Mephibosheth, you and I are spiritually crippled. Like Mephibosheth, we live in exile. We were exiled from the garden. We were exiled from the place that we should have been able to call home. We are outside of the kingdom of peace and plenty and comfort. We all lived at one stage in Lo-debar, the place of no land, the place of thistles and thorns, living under the curse, eking out a living, just trying to get by. And our world is full of Mephibosheths who live in fancy houses but have empty homes, and who have full bank accounts but empty souls. People who are living outside of the kingdom. And what is it that we should expect? We who are by nature children of wrath and who live in the wilderness, what should we expect? We should expect wrath. We are by nature God's enemies, and when we are called to appear before the king, what should we expect the king to do? Mephibosheth arrives before the king and expects to have his head removed from his shoulders. That's what should have happened in a normal political, perhaps not today, but back then, that's how they dealt with political issues. And in kindness, God should just execute us and get it done with. That would be a kind act of God. But we know what God does, don't we? Oh, I'm just a dead dog. God shows Hesed. His never-ending, never-stopping, never giving up, unbreakable, always and forever love, and He shows it to you. I'm not sure that we really want to grasp all that. We don't like it. It doesn't fit well with our society. That kind of story often doesn't fit well in church. No one wants to be told they're Mephibosheth. I mean, how many of you like the idea? How many of you like being called a shameful one? You know, none of us want to be that. We all want to be David. And so most churches, I think, you'll go to and hear a sermon like this morning, and it'll be, yeah, you're David. Be David. No one wants the lowering of your self-esteem by calling you a shameful thing. And yet, that's what sin has done to us. And I think if we don't understand this, then we don't understand the gospel. If you think that you're just an averagely nice guy and that you should do your best to try and be like David, all you have is a nice moral self-image boost. Try harder, be nicer. Might as well be a Buddhist. Because that doesn't actually change you. That doesn't break open all that God has to offer you. It ends up in either of two things. It either ends up with, look at how nice I am to crippled people. Look how nice I am to the other abled. God owes me. I should be rewarded for what I have done. Or it leaves you racked with guilt. I don't do enough. I can't do it. I've never done enough. Oh my goodness. How am I ever? I'm going to have to pay God off somehow. If your gospel is one of try hard, be like David, be nice, those are the two options you have. You end up either filled with pride, look at how wonderful I am, let me pat myself on the back, God owes me, or how awful I am because I can't match up and I'm just broken and I might as well just be squished and I'll just give up and go home now. Those are the two options that you have. But when you go, I am Mephibosheth, I am the one who's broken, and God shows me Hesed, his never-ending love, that changes things. Because then here's what happens. Here are the things that we hear God saying to us. He says to us, first of all, do not fear. Do not fear. Suddenly God is not an entity to appease. I haven't done enough. I've got to try harder. It's not about fear. It's not about guilt. It's not about earning his approval. It's not about generating my worth and self-esteem. It's not about waiting for the lightning to strike me when I step out of line. In the presence of the King, there is no fear, and God removes fear. Secondly, it's about restoration. It's what the gospel is about restoring. It doesn't mean that you're going to own a piece of land in the Middle East one day. Again, how many of you would like a little section in the Gaza Strip right now? Real estate's going there for real cheap at the moment if you want to grab a bargain, right? The gospel is not about earning and getting a little piece of land in Israel somewhere, even if it is on the banks of the Red Sea or whatever, Dead Sea, Galilee, whichever one. But it does mean that you and I get to enjoy the fullness of the covenant promises of God. And that, I love these words from the prophet Joel, where he says that God will restore the years that the locusts have eaten. The devastation of the blighted spiritual plane of your life will be restored. And God brings you into His kingdom and restores the broken and the messed up and the bruised and the ashamed. Because actually, we are ashamed. Many of us live with shame. And the curse is overturned and becomes a blessing. Thirdly, you get to sit at the table of the King. He invites you in. And there's Paul at the table, got his shirt down here. This scar I got when they whipped me, 39 times. And this scar over here, that's where they threw rocks at me. They threw me with a brick right there. And there's Peter going, I remember that time I walked on water. And Andrew's like, walked on water, sank like a stone, more like it. And they're sitting at the table talking about all the things they did. Remember the feeding of 5,000 and when we went around with the baskets. Remember that time? And then you walk in. And you sit down. And Moses kind of looks at you and goes, and you? What are you doing here? The King invited me. The King invited me. This is a bit of a stretch. Mephibosheth is given servants to care for him. Bear with me. It makes sense in a moment. Do you remember Jesus saying something like this? I came not to be served, but to serve and give my life as a ransom for many. Do you remember him on his knees washing his disciples' feet? Don't get this mixed up. Jesus is not our servant in the sense that I am the master and I get to tell him what to do. Many people in churches around the world have that kind of relationship with Jesus. That's not what it is. But Jesus has come to serve. And it's a bit of a tough thing to get our heads around. He lays down his life for himself, for us, takes on the nature of a servant, and gives himself to death on a cross. Here's what John Piper says about this. He quotes from Luke chapter 12. Truly I say to you, he will gird himself and have them sit at table, and he will come and serve them. As Jesus talking about himself, serving the saints. John Piper says, not only that, he is our servant now. He says, I will never fail you nor forsake you. Hence we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do? Does this belittle the risen Christ to say that he was and is and ever will be the servant of his people? It would if servant meant the one who takes orders, or if we thought that we were his masters. That would dishonor him. But it does not dishonor him to say that we are weak and needy. It does not dishonor him to say that he is the only one who can service us with what we need the most. It does not dishonor him to say that he is an inexhaustible spring of love, and that the more he helps us and the more that we depend on his service, the more amazing his resources appear. Therefore, we can confidently say, Jesus Christ is alive to serve. Can you see how that is a whole lot better than be like David? Try hard. Be nice. Be good to needy people. And yet, the application does take us there in the end. Because the story actually is about helping your neighbor, about helping the crippled and the lame. And here's why. Here's how it works like that. The next time you're at a traffic light and the guy on crutches comes to your window, all raggedy with his hand held out, you're looking at yourself in a mirror. That's the story of Mephibosheth. That I see there in physical form my spiritual state. And God in Hesed reached out to me when I was just like that. And so the whole point of the story then is not to say, oh, isn't this wonderful? God is so nice to me. I've been restored. I don't need to fear anymore. This is great news. The whole point of this is to go, if God has done this for me, how can I not be moved by this and do this for others? Not try hard, be like David, but how can I not be moved by what He has done? If I have grasped what He has done, the natural response is to pass that on to others. And so we're driven by this, that I am the leper, I am the cripple, I am the ruined sinner, and in great kindness and mercy, He has lifted me, and how can I not do the same? My challenge at the end this morning, this is the end, is just this. How and where and who? Because ultimately that's where it needs to go. What do we do with this? What do we do once the gospel is sunk in and we've got this? Where do we look now to display God's Hesed to others? Young adults at our church in Waterfall about 6 months ago decided they needed to do something like this. They went and found a very under-resourced and underfunded children's home, a place where the two ladies take on orphaned or abandoned disabled children. There are about 20 kids in there. And our teenagers, young adults go there once a month just to play with kids, just to play. Maybe it's someone you know who needs a wheelchair but can't afford one. And can we put money together? Can we go fundraising just for a wheelchair? And again, it's more than just helping buy wheelchairs. It's about loving your neighbor and expressing God's love, the love that He has shown to you, and expressing that to those in need. To be a neighbor to the other, to be a neighbor to the different. And for some, that may mean crossing the race lines. For others, that may mean moving towards doing something about the impoverished and the needy. I don't know who in a sense, who your Mephibosheth is. Maybe it's even a member of your family who's just really difficult to love, emotionally crippled. But when we see that we are Mephibosheth and that we are the objects of Hesed by the king, our eyes open up to see all the other Mephibosheths around us and all the opportunities that are there for us to pass on just a sense of that same Hesed to them. If we fail to see ourselves as Mephibosheth, we will be blind to the world and its needs around us. And we will look down with disdain on the cripples and the beggars that we meet. And we'll go, at least I'm not as bad as them. But if we truly grasp who we are, I am Mephibosheth, we will never lose sight of the gospel, and we'll never lose sight of God's never stopping, never giving up, unbreakable, always and forever love for His people. Let's pray together. Well, Jesus, it would be so nice for us to read a story like this and go, yep, I'm David, I'm the hero, I'm the good guy. But the reality is that we can't say that. We're all Mephibosheth. I suspect all of us here have things in our past that we are ashamed of. Perhaps some things even in very recent memory that we are ashamed of. For many of us, there is good reason to be ashamed. Lord, if we're honest this morning, we'd have to acknowledge that we are spiritual cripples, that we are broken and needy on the inside. Many of us are emotionally done. Truly, we are Mephibosheth. And yet, in your great mercy and love, you have reached out to us. You have shown us your never-ending, never giving up, unbreakable, always and forever love. You have taken we who are shameful and given us the glory of your Son. You heal the wounded and the bent and the broken. You restore. And Lord, this morning, would we know that? Would we know that here today? Those that still bear the shame, may they hear those words, do not be afraid. And Lord, may we, as a result of this, have our eyes opened to see the Mephibosheths around us. And that we will mimic our great King and display chesed. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.